August 1945. The war is over. But for thousands of Japanese soldiers, surrender meant something worse than death. They had been told Americans would torture them, mutilate them, parade their bodies through the streets. So when Private James Callahan handed a canteen of water to a trembling Japanese prisoner, the man dropped to his knees and pressed his forehead into the dirt. Jim stood there, confused, uncomfortable. He looked down at the prisoner and said the words that would change everything. "You don't have to bow. This is the true story of what happened when two enemies met not on the battlefield, but in the silence after the guns stopped firing." September 2nd, 1945. Manila, Philippines. The Aguinaldo POW camp. Private James Callahan had seen war. He had fought through the blood-soaked beaches of Okinawa, watched his friends die in the mud, heard the screams of banzai charges in the night. The smell of sulfur and burnt flesh still haunted his dreams. He remembered the cave fighting, the close-quarters combat where you couldn't tell if the shadow in front of you was a rock or a man waiting to kill you. He remembered pulling his best friend Danny out of a crater, only to realize half of Danny's body was missing. He remembered the medic who tried to save a wounded Marine, only to be shot by a sniper hiding in the jungle canopy. Jim had learned to hate. It was easy to hate when the enemy fought like demons, when they refused to surrender, when they strapped explosives to their bodies and ran at you screaming. But now, standing in the Aguinaldo camp, staring at rows and rows of defeated Japanese soldiers, Jim didn't feel hate. He felt something else, something uncomfortable, something that felt dangerously close to pity. The prisoners sat in the dirt, heads down, hands tied behind their backs, eyes hollow and distant. They weren't warriors anymore. They were ghosts. Skeletons wrapped in torn uniforms. Their faces were gaunt, cheekbones pressing against thin skin, eyes sunken deep into their skulls. Some had open wounds that had been left untreated for weeks, infections spreading like wildfire through their weakened bodies. Others shook with fever, malaria burning through them, their bodies too weak to fight it off. The smell was unbearable. Death and dysentery mixed with the humid Philippine heat, creating a thick, nauseating stench that clung to everything. Jim walked past them, boots crunching on gravel, and tried not to look at their faces. But he couldn't help it. He saw a young soldier, couldn't have been more than 18, staring at nothing, tears streaming down his cheeks. He saw an older man, maybe in his 40s, clutching a photograph of what looked like his family, his lips moving in silent prayer. He saw men who had been told they were invincible, that they were fighting for a divine emperor, that death was preferable to surrender. And now they sat here, broken, waiting for whatever came next. Jim had been assigned to guard duty at the camp, part of the occupation force tasked with processing thousands of Japanese POWs. The orders were clear: follow the Geneva Convention, provide food, water, medical care, treat them humanely. But for many American soldiers, that was a hard pill to swallow. These were the same men who had committed the Bataan Death March, who had bayoneted medics, who had tortured prisoners, who had refused to surrender until the very end, taking as many Americans with them as possible. Jim remembered Eddie Kowalski, a fellow private from Brooklyn, spitting on the ground as the first truck of prisoners rolled in. "They don't deserve this," Eddie muttered, his voice thick with rage. "They deserve what they gave us, nothing." Jim didn't respond. He didn't know what he believed yet. Part of him agreed with Eddie. Part of him remembered Danny, remembered the medic, remembered all the boys who would never go home. But another part of him, a quieter part, looked at these defeated men and wondered if hatred was worth carrying anymore. Lieutenant Daniel Cooper stood at the camp entrance, clipboard in hand, watching the flood of prisoners being processed. Daniel was older, 35, a veteran of the First World War. He had seen the trenches of France, the mustard gas rolling across no man's land, the senseless slaughter of an entire generation. He had watched boys charge into machine gun fire, watched them drown in mud, watched them claw at their own throats as gas burned their lungs from the inside. He had thought that war was the worst thing humanity could do to itself. And then came this war that stretched across oceans, that turned entire cities into ash, that introduced the world to weapons so terrible they could erase 100,000 lives in a single blinding flash. Daniel had thought he understood war, but this war had taught him that there were always new depths to explore, new horrors to uncover. And now, decades after he thought he'd left the battlefield behind, here he was again, babysitting the enemy. But this time, it was different. This time, he had a personal stake. His younger brother Thomas had been captured at Bataan in 1942. Thomas had been a medic, 23 years old, fresh out of medical school, eager to serve. He had written letters home, telling their mother not to worry, that he was safe, that he was helping people. And then the letters stopped. Daniel didn't know if Thomas had died on the death march, in a camp, or somewhere in between. All he knew was that the Japanese had taken him. The War Department had listed Thomas as missing, presumed dead, but there was no body, no confirmation, just a void where his brother used to be. And now, Daniel was supposed to keep these men alive, the same men who might have killed Thomas, the same men who might have stood by and watched as American prisoners starved, as they were beaten, as they died from disease and neglect. It felt like a cruel joke. It felt like the universe was testing him, pushing him to see how much he could endure before he broke. Daniel lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and walked into the camp. His job was to make sure the guards followed protocol. No beatings, no executions, no revenge. The United States wasn't Imperial Japan. They would prove that, even if it hurt, even if every fiber of his being wanted to turn away, to let nature take its course, to let these men suffer the way Thomas had suffered. But Daniel was a soldier. He followed orders, and the orders were clear. Inside the medical tent, Captain Eleanor Mitchell was elbow deep in blood. A Japanese soldier lay on the table in front of her, shrapnel lodged in his abdomen, infection spreading through his body like poison. His skin was hot to the touch, fever raging, and he was delirious, muttering in Japanese, words she couldn't understand. Eleanor worked quickly, hands steady despite the exhaustion that weighed on her like a physical thing. She had been a nurse since 1943, deployed to field hospitals across the Pacific. She had stitched up American boys with their guts hanging out, had held their hands as they died, had written letters to their mothers explaining that their sons had been brave, that they hadn't suffered, even when it was a lie. Eleanor had seen things that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had seen a Marine brought in with half his face blown off, still conscious, still trying to speak. She had seen a pilot pulled from a burning plane, his skin melted to his flight suit. She had seen boys, barely 18, crying for their mothers as they bled out on her table. And she had heard the stories of what the Japanese did to captured nurses, to medics, to anyone who couldn't fight back. She had heard about the nurses in the Philippines captured after Bataan fell, forced to march, beaten, starved. Some of them had survived. Many hadn't. Eleanor had met one of the survivors, a woman named Margaret, who had been held in a camp for 3 years. Margaret had told her about the conditions, about the disease, about the guards who took pleasure in cruelty. And Eleanor had listened, had felt rage build inside her, had sworn that if she ever had the chance, she would make them pay. But now, standing over this Japanese soldier, watching him struggle for breath, Eleanor felt something else. She felt the weight of her oath. She had sworn to heal, to help, to do no harm. And that oath didn't come with exceptions. It didn't say, heal only the people you like, help only the people who deserve it. It said heal, period. So Eleanor pushed down the rage, pushed down the memories, and focused on the work. She cleaned the wound, removed the shrapnel, stitched him up as best she could with the limited supplies she had. The soldier gasped, eyes fluttering open. He saw her face, saw the Red Cross armband, and his expression twisted into something between terror and confusion. He tried to speak, but no words came. His lips moved, forming shapes she couldn't interpret, and his eyes filled with tears. Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder, gently pushing him back down. "You're safe," she said quietly, knowing he didn't understand the words but hoping he understood the tone. "You're safe." The soldier stared at her for a long moment, and then he closed his eyes, exhausted, and let himself slip back into unconsciousness. Eleanor stepped back, stripped off her gloves, and allowed herself a moment to breathe. She was exhausted. She was angry. She was confused. But she was still here, still doing the work, still honoring her oath, even if it hurt. Sergeant Takeshi Yamada sat in the dirt, hands bound behind his back, head bowed low. He had been a soldier for 10 years. He had fought in China, in the Philippines, in the jungles and the mountains. He had followed orders without question, had believed in the emperor with the fervor of a true believer, had been told that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, that death was preferable to capture. The code of Bushido had been drilled into him since he was a child. A true warrior does not surrender. A true warrior dies with honor. A true warrior serves the emperor until his last breath. Takeshi had believed it all. He had seen soldiers commit seppuku rather than face capture. He had seen officers shoot their own men to prevent them from surrendering. He had participated in the execution of prisoners, had been told that enemy soldiers who surrendered were weak, cowardly, unworthy of life, and he had believed it, because that was what he had been taught. That was what everyone believed. But now, sitting here in the dirt, hands tied, surrounded by hundreds of other captured soldiers, Takeshi felt the full weight of his dishonor. He had surrendered. He had chosen life over death. He had failed the emperor. He had failed his ancestors. He had failed himself. When the Americans first took him, Takeshi had expected execution. He had seen what Japanese forces did to prisoners. He had participated in it. He knew the rules of war, or at least the rules he had been taught. Prisoners were weak. Prisoners were cowards. Prisoners deserved no mercy. So when the American soldiers marched him and dozens of others into the camp, Takeshi had prepared himself for death. He had closed his eyes, had whispered a prayer to his ancestors, had asked for forgiveness, but death didn't come. Instead, they gave him water. They gave him rice. They gave him a blanket. They assigned him a barracks. They treated his wounds. Takeshi didn't understand. He sat in his assigned barracks that first night, surrounded by other captured soldiers, and whispered to the man next to him, a young corporal named Hiroshi Tanaka. "Why are they doing this?" Hiroshi shook his head, eyes wide with fear and confusion. "I don't know. Maybe they're fattening us up before they kill us. Maybe this is part of the torture. Make us think we're safe." And then, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both knew what happened to prisoners. They had both seen it. But as the days passed and the execution never came, Takeshi began to wonder. He watched the American guards distribute food rations. He watched the nurses treat wounded prisoners. He watched the camp commander walk through the barracks inspecting conditions, making sure the prisoners had adequate shelter. And he couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been taught. These were supposed to be demons, barbarians, animals who would torture and kill without mercy. But instead they were human. They were tired. They were young. Some of them looked at the prisoners with hatred, yes, but others looked at them with something else. Something Takeshi couldn't name. Something that looked almost like pity. Private James Callahan walked the perimeter of the camp as the sun began to set, rifle slung over his shoulder, boots scuffing against the dusty ground. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that would have been beautiful if he wasn't standing in the middle of a POW camp in the Philippines. Jim thought about home, about his family's farm in Kansas, about the way the wheat fields looked in the summer, golden and endless, stretching all the way to the horizon, about his mother's letters which arrived every few weeks, filled with news from home. His younger sister had gotten married. His father was struggling with the harvest because so many of the farm hands had gone off to war. His mother asked, every single time, when he was coming home. Jim didn't know. He had been overseas for 2 years now. 2 years of fighting, of watching friends die, of living in constant fear that the next bullet, the next shell, the next banzai charge would be the one with his name on it. And now the war was over. The fighting was done. But he was still here, still in uniform, still far from home, still trying to make sense of everything he had seen and done. Jim thought about the Japanese soldier who had bowed to him earlier that day. It had been a simple moment, unremarkable in the grand scheme of things. Jim had been distributing water rations, moving down the line of prisoners with a canteen and a ladle. It was hot, brutally hot, and the prisoners had been working all day on a construction detail. They were exhausted, dehydrated, covered in dust and sweat. When Jim reached the soldier, a man in his late 20s with hollow eyes and cracked lips, he dipped the ladle into the canteen and handed it over. The man took it with trembling hands, drank deeply, and then, without warning, dropped to his knees. He pressed his forehead to the ground, trembling, and whispered something in Japanese. Jim didn't know what to do. He stood there, awkward and uncomfortable, staring down at this man who was prostrating himself in the dirt. It felt wrong. It felt like too much. Jim wasn't a god. He wasn't a savior. He was just a farm kid from Kansas who had been handed a rifle and told to fight. He didn't deserve this kind of reverence, so he spoke, the words coming out before he could stop them. "You don't have to bow." The man looked up, confusion written across his face. Jim extended a hand, gesturing for him to stand. The man hesitated, glanced around as if checking to see if this was some kind of trick, and then slowly, carefully, rose to his feet. They stood there for a moment, two soldiers from opposite sides of the world, separated by language and culture and everything they had been taught to believe, and yet somehow connected by this small act of kindness. Jim nodded, then moved on to the next prisoner. But the image stayed with him, the way the man had looked at him, the fear, the gratitude, the confusion. It stayed with him as he finished distributing water. It stayed with him as he walked the perimeter. It stayed with him that night as he lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying to sleep. He kept thinking about that moment, about the look in the man's eyes, about the way he had bowed as if Jim had given him something precious instead of just a ladle of water. And Jim realized something. He realized that this man, this enemy soldier, had expected to be treated like an animal. He had expected cruelty. He had expected suffering. And when he received kindness instead, even something as small as water, it had shattered his understanding of the world. Lieutenant Daniel Cooper sat in his office, a small room with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. He was reviewing reports, going through the daily logs, making sure everything was running smoothly. The camp was overcrowded. They had been designed to hold 5,000 prisoners, but they currently had over 8,000. Supplies were running low. The medical tent was overwhelmed. Disease was spreading, dysentery and malaria and infections that they didn't have enough medicine to treat. And tensions were high, both among the prisoners and the guards. Daniel had already broken up 2 fights this week. The first had been between American soldiers, one of whom wanted to rough up a prisoner who had supposedly disrespected him, and another who believed in following orders. The second had been between prisoners, a dispute over food rations that had nearly turned violent. Daniel was exhausted. He was running on 4 hours of sleep a night, and he could feel the stress eating away at him. But he kept going, because that was what soldiers did. They kept going. Daniel thought about his brother. He thought about Thomas constantly, couldn't stop himself even when he tried. He imagined what Thomas's last days had been like. Had he been scared? Had he been in pain? Had he known he was going to die? Or had he held on to hope until the very end? Daniel didn't know. He would never know. And that uncertainty was almost worse than knowing. He pulled open his desk drawer and took out the last letter Thomas had sent, dated April 1942, just before Bataan fell. The paper was worn, the creases deep from being folded and unfolded hundreds of times. Daniel read it again, even though he had memorized every word. Thomas wrote about the patients he was treating, about the shortages of medicine and supplies, about how hard everyone was working. But he also wrote about hope. He wrote about how they were going to win this war, how they were going to go home, how he was going to finish medical school and open a practice and make their mother proud. Thomas had been optimistic. He had believed. And then he had died, slowly and painfully, in a camp where no one cared if he lived or died. Daniel folded the letter carefully and put it back in the drawer. He wanted to hate these men. He wanted to let his grief turn into rage, wanted to walk into the camp and make them pay for what they had done to Thomas. But every time he walked through the camp, every time he saw the fear in their eyes, the desperation, the resignation, he couldn't, because they weren't monsters. They were soldiers, just like Thomas, just like him. They had followed orders. They had believed what they were told. They had fought for their country, just like he had fought for his. And that realization was harder to bear than hatred, because hatred was simple. Hatred gave him a target, gave him something to focus his pain on. But understanding, empathy, recognizing the humanity in the enemy, that was complicated. That required him to acknowledge that war wasn't a battle between good and evil. It was a battle between people, all of whom believed they were doing the right thing. And that truth was unbearable. Major Kenji Sato was the highest-ranking Japanese officer in the camp. At 43, He had served in the Imperial Army for over 2 decades. He had commanded battalions, led men into battle, made decisions that had cost lives. He had fought in Manchuria, in China, across the Pacific. He had been a true believer, had dedicated his life to the Emperor and to the glory of Japan. But now, sitting in a POW camp, stripped of his rank and his dignity, Kenji was forced to confront reality. Japan had lost. The Empire had fallen. Everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in, was gone. And he was alive. He had surrendered. He had chosen survival over honor, and that choice haunted him. In the early days of his captivity, Kenji had considered suicide. It would have been the honorable thing to do, but he hadn't. He had chosen to live, and now he had to figure out what that meant. Lieutenant Cooper had approached Kenji in the second week, asking for his help in maintaining order among the prisoners. Kenji had been surprised. He had expected to be treated as the enemy, to be isolated, perhaps even punished for his rank. But instead, Cooper had treated him with a strange kind of respect. Not as an equal exactly, but as a man. Cooper had explained that cooperation would benefit everyone, that resistance would only bring suffering. And Kenji, pragmatic to his core, had agreed. He spoke to the men, explained that survival required adaptation, that cooperation was their best chance. Some listened. Others called him a traitor, spat at him, refused to acknowledge his authority. Kenji didn't care. He had seen enough death. He wanted to live. And if that meant working with the Americans, so be it. But even Kenji, cynical and pragmatic as he was, found himself surprised by the treatment they received. The food was plain, rice and vegetables and occasionally some meat, but it was regular. 3 meals a day. More than many of them had eaten in months. The medical care was basic, but it was real. Nurses treated their wounds. Doctors prescribed medicine, and no one was left to die in the dirt. The guards were stern, but they weren't cruel. There were no beatings, no torture, no executions. It was nothing like what Kenji had been taught to expect, and it made him question everything he thought he knew about the enemy. Weeks passed, and the camp settled into a routine. Prisoners were assigned work details, repairing roads, clearing debris, building infrastructure. It was hard labor, but it wasn't punishment. The Americans worked alongside them, and there was a strange sense of camaraderie that developed, born not out of friendship, but out of shared exhaustion. Jim found himself on a construction crew with Sergeant Takeshi Yamada. They didn't speak the same language, but they communicated through gestures, through shared exhaustion, through the universal language of sweat and dirt. Jim learned that Takeshi had been a farmer before the war, that he had a wife and 2 children back in Japan, that he missed them desperately. Takeshi learned that Jim was from Kansas, that he had grown up on a farm, that he understood the rhythm of planting and harvest. They found common ground in the soil, in the work, in the simple act of building something instead of destroying it. One afternoon, as they hauled lumber under the brutal sun, Takeshi stumbled. He had been weakened by months of malnutrition, and the heat was too much. His vision blurred, his legs gave out, and he fell to his knees, gasping for air. Jim dropped his load and rushed over. He pulled out his canteen and offered it. Takeshi hesitated, glanced around as if expecting someone to stop him, and then drank deeply. When he finished, he bowed his head, an automatic gesture, ingrained by years of culture and conditioning. Jim shook his head. No bowing. Remember? Takeshi looked up, and for the first time Jim saw something other than fear in his eyes. He saw gratitude. He saw recognition. He saw a man, not an enemy, not a monster, just a man, tired, scared, trying to survive, just like Jim. They stood there for a moment, and then Jim extended a hand, helping Takeshi to his feet. They went back to work side by side, and something shifted between them. It wasn't friendship. It was too early, too fragile for that. But it was understanding. It was the beginning of something that neither of them had expected to find in a place like this. Captain Eleanor Mitchell had treated dozens of Japanese prisoners by now. Some had injuries from battle, shrapnel wounds and bullet holes and burns. Others had infections, malaria, dysentery, diseases that ravaged their weakened bodies. She worked tirelessly, moving from patient to patient, doing what she could with limited supplies. There was never enough medicine, never enough bandages, never enough time. but she did what she could. One day, a young prisoner, Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka, was brought in with a severe fever. He was delirious, thrashing on the cot, calling out for his mother in Japanese. Eleanor worked to stabilize him, wiping his forehead with a cool cloth, administering what little quinine she had left. As she worked, she thought about the American soldiers she had treated, the boys who had cried for their mothers, who had begged her to tell them they'd be okay, who had died holding her hand. And she realized that suffering didn't have a nationality. Pain didn't choose sides. Fear was universal. The instinct to call for your mother when you were scared and dying, that was human. Not American, not Japanese, human. When Hiroshi finally opened his eyes, he looked at her with confusion and terror. He tried to sit up, tried to speak, but Eleanor gently pushed him back down. "You're going to be okay," she said softly, knowing he didn't understand the words, but hoping he understood the tone. "You're safe." Hiroshi stared at her, tears streaming down his face, and then he whispered something in Japanese. Eleanor didn't know what he said, but she could guess. "Thank you." Or maybe, "Why are you helping me?" Or maybe, "I don't deserve this." She would never know. But she nodded, squeezed his hand gently, and moved on to the next patient. Later that night, as Eleanor lay in her bunk, exhausted and unable to sleep, she thought about Margaret, about the nurse who had survived 3 years in a Japanese camp, about the stories Margaret had told. And Eleanor wondered if there had been any Japanese nurses in those camps, any Japanese doctors who had tried to help, who had shown kindness despite the orders they were given. She wondered if there had been moments of humanity in those places, small acts of defiance against the cruelty. She hoped there had been, because if there hadn't been, if those camps had been nothing but darkness, then what did that say about humanity? What did that say about the world? Lieutenant Daniel Cooper received a letter. It had taken months to reach him, passed through military channels, delayed by bureaucracy and the chaos of the post-war world. It was from the War Department, official, formal, cold, the kind of letter that changed everything. Daniel opened it with trembling hands, already knowing what it would say. "We regret to inform you that your brother, Corporal Thomas Cooper, died in a Japanese POW camp in 1943. Cause of death, malnutrition, and disease. His remains have not been recovered." Daniel read the letter 3 times. He sat in his office, alone, and let the grief wash over him. Thomas had suffered. He had starved. He had died alone, far from home, in the hands of an enemy that had shown no mercy. And now, Daniel was supposed to show mercy to them. He wanted to scream. He wanted to rage. He wanted to walk into the camp and make them pay. He wanted to line them up and ask them, "Were you there? Did you watch my brother die? Did you stand by and do nothing while he wasted away?" But he didn't, because Thomas wouldn't have wanted that. Daniel knew his brother. Thomas had been kind, gentle, compassionate. He had become a medic because he wanted to help people, not hurt them. He had believed in doing the right thing, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. And so Daniel folded the letter, placed it in his desk next to Thomas's last letter, and went back to work. He would honor his brother by being better than the men who had killed him. He would honor Thomas by proving that humanity could survive even in the darkest places. Private Eddie Kowalski still hadn't come around. He watched Jim interact with the prisoners, saw the way some of the guards had started treating them like human beings, and it made him sick. Eddie had lost friends on Okinawa. He had watched them die, had carried their bodies, had written letters to their families, and now he was supposed to be nice to the people who had killed them? It didn't make sense. It felt like a betrayal. One night, he confronted Jim outside the barracks. "You're getting soft," Eddie said, his voice thick with anger. "These bastards killed our guys. They don't deserve your kindness. They don't deserve anything except a bullet." Jim looked at him, tired and worn down by months of this argument. "What do you want me to do, Eddie? Beat them? Starve them? Become just like them?" Eddie spat on the ground. Maybe that's what they deserve." Jim shook his head. "Then we've lost. Not the war. Ourselves. If we become like them, if we let this war turn us into monsters, then what was the point? What did all those guys die for?" Eddie stared at him, jaw clenched, fists balled at his sides, but he didn't have an answer. He walked away, angry and frustrated, but Jim's words stayed with him. They gnawed at him. kept him awake at night, forced him to confront questions he didn't want to answer. Sergeant Takeshi Yamada sat in his barracks one evening, writing a letter by the light of a single candle. He didn't know if it would ever reach his family, didn't know if the mail system was even functioning in Japan anymore, but he needed to write it. He needed to tell them that he was alive, that he had been captured, that he had dishonored himself by surrendering, but also that he had been treated with a kindness he never expected. He wrote about Private Jim Callahan, about the water, about the words, "You don't have to bow." He wrote about how those words had shattered everything he believed, about how he was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, the enemy wasn't evil. Maybe they were just men like him, men who were tired of war, who wanted to go home, who were trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. Takeshi wrote about the work details, about the food, about the medical care. He wrote about how strange it was to be treated like a human being by the people he had been taught to hate. And he wrote about the guilt, the crushing, suffocating guilt that came with every act of kindness. Because if the Americans were capable of this, of treating their enemies with dignity, then what did that say about what Takeshi had done? What did that say about the prisoners he had executed, the villages he had burned, the orders he had followed without question? Takeshi didn't have answers. He only had questions, and those questions haunted him. Months turned into a year. The war was over, but the prisoners remained. Repatriation was slow, complicated by politics and logistics and the sheer scale of the task. Millions of soldiers needed to be sent home, and Japan was in chaos. Cities had been destroyed. The government was in shambles. The economy had collapsed. There was nowhere to send the prisoners, no infrastructure to support them. So they stayed in the camps, in limbo, waiting. The camp became a strange kind of community, a place where former enemies lived side by side. Not as friends, but not as enemies either. Jim and Takeshi continued to work together. They learned bits of each other's language. Jim taught Takeshi English words. Hello, thank you, water, home. Takeshi taught Jim Japanese phrases. Arigato, sumimasen, kazoku, family. They talked about their families, their homes, their dreams. They didn't talk about the war. That was too raw, too painful. But they talked about everything else. About farming, about the weather, about what they would do when they finally got to go home. And slowly, carefully, a bond formed. Not friendship exactly. It was too complicated for that. But something close. Something that neither of them had expected to find in a place like this. Captain Eleanor Mitchell found herself spending more time in the camp than she needed to. She had started teaching basic English to some of the prisoners, helping them prepare for repatriation. It gave her something to do, something productive, something that felt like it mattered. Hiroshi Tanaka was one of her students. He was eager to learn, grateful for the opportunity. He practiced constantly, repeating words and phrases, stumbling over pronunciation, but never giving up. One day, he brought her a small origami crane, folded from a scrap of paper he had found somewhere. He handed it to her, bowing slightly out of habit, and said in careful, broken English, "Thank you, for help, for kindness." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. She took the crane, held it gently in her palm, and nodded. "You're welcome, Hiroshi." He smiled, a real smile, and Eleanor realized that this was why she had become a nurse. Not for the glory, not for the recognition, but for moments like this. Moments where she could make a difference, where she could help someone, where she could prove that kindness still existed in a world that had tried so hard to destroy it. Lieutenant Daniel Cooper stood at the camp gate one morning, watching as the first group of prisoners prepared to leave. They were being sent back to Japan, back to a country that had been devastated by war, back to an uncertain future. The men lined up, clutching their small bundles of belongings, faces a mixture of relief and fear. Major Kenji Sato approached Daniel, bowing respectfully. "Lieutenant Cooper, thank you for everything, for treating us with dignity, for showing us that not all enemies are monsters." Daniel looked at him, this man who had once been his enemy, who might have been in China when Thomas was captured, who might have given orders that led to American deaths. And he felt a strange sense of closure. Not forgiveness exactly. He wasn't sure he could forgive, but acceptance. Acceptance that the world was complicated, that people were complicated, that war turned everyone into something they didn't want to be. "Take care of yourself, Major." Kenji nodded, then turned and walked toward the truck. Daniel watched him go, and for the first time since Thomas's death, he felt a weight lift from his chest. He couldn't bring his brother back, but he could make sure that other brothers on both sides had a chance to go home. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all any of them could do. Private Eddie Kowalski finally broke. He had watched day after day as the camp operated with discipline and humanity. He had seen prisoners recover, smile, laugh. He had seen American soldiers treat them with respect, had seen bonds form where there should have been only hatred, and he had realized something. Hatred was exhausting. It took energy to hate, to hold on to rage, to let it consume you. And Eddie was tired. He was so tired. One day he approached Jim. "I still don't like them," Eddie said, his voice quiet. "I don't think I ever will. But I get it. What you said about not becoming like them." Jim nodded. "That's all I'm asking." Eddie extended a hand. Jim shook it. And that was that. No grand revelation, no dramatic moment. Just two soldiers, tired and worn down by war, trying to figure out how to be human again. Sergeant Takeshi Yamada stood in line, waiting to board the ship that would take him back to Japan. He looked back at the camp, at the place that had been his prison and his salvation. He saw the barracks where he had slept, the mess hall where he had eaten, the construction sites where he had worked. He saw the American guards standing at their posts, rifles slung over their shoulders, watching the prisoners leave. And he saw Private Jim Callahan standing near the gate, watching. Takeshi walked over, his heart pounding. He bowed deeply, an automatic gesture, and then caught himself. He straightened, remembering the words. "You don't have to bow." He extended his hand instead, the way he had seen Americans do. Jim smiled, a real smile, and shook it. "Take care, Takeshi." Takeshi nodded, struggling with the English words, trying to find the right thing to say. "You too, Jim. Thank you. For water. For everything. For showing me that enemies can be human." Jim's smile widened. "You never had to bow." Takeshi nodded, understanding now. Understanding that the gesture had never been about submission. It had been about gratitude, about respect, about recognizing the humanity in another person. "I know," Takeshi said quietly, "but I wanted to. Not because I was afraid, because I was grateful." And then he turned and walked toward the ship, toward home, toward a future he never thought he'd have. The Aguinaldo POW camp closed in 1946. Thousands of Japanese prisoners passed through its gates, and almost all of them returned home alive. It was a stark contrast to the camps run by the Imperial Japanese Army, where mortality rates were as high as 27%. The treatment of Japanese POWs by American forces became a case study in the application of the Geneva Convention. It demonstrated that even in the aftermath of brutal conflict, humanity could prevail. That even when every instinct screamed for revenge, for retribution, for an eye, it was possible to choose a different path. Private James Callahan returned to Kansas in late 1946. He married a girl from his hometown, raised 3 children, and took over his father's farm. He rarely spoke about the war. When his children asked, he would tell them stories about the friends he had made, the places he had seen, but he never talked about the fighting, never talked about the death. There was only one story he told, again and again, the story of a Japanese soldier who had bowed to him, and the words he had spoken in response. "You don't have to bow." Jim kept a small photograph taken at the camp of him standing next to Takeshi. On the back he had written, "A reminder that enemies are just people on the other side." Sergeant Takeshi Yamada returned to a devastated Japan. His village had been destroyed by American bombing raids. His house was gone, but his family had survived. His wife and children had been evacuated to the countryside, and they were alive. Takeshi rebuilt his life slowly, painfully. He became a teacher, educating a new generation of Japanese children, and he spent his later years advocating for peace and reconciliation, traveling to schools and universities, telling his story. He told them about the war, about the propaganda, about the lies they had been told. And he told them about Private Jim Callahan, about the water, about the words, "You don't have to bow." He told them that the greatest lesson he had learned was that the enemy was human, that war didn't create monsters, it revealed them, but it also revealed heroes, people who chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier. People who chose humanity when hatred would have been justified. Lieutenant Daniel Cooper stayed in the Army, rising to the rank of colonel. He dedicated his career to improving POW treatment protocols, working with international organizations to ensure that the lessons learned in the Pacific were never forgotten. He pushed for stronger enforcement of the Geneva Convention, for better training for soldiers tasked with guarding prisoners, for systems that would prevent the kind of atrocities that had defined so much of the Second World War. And every year, on the anniversary of Thomas's death, Daniel would visit Arlington National Cemetery. He would stand at the tomb of the unknown soldier, and he would think about his brother, about the boy who had wanted to be a doctor, who had believed in helping people, who had died far from home. And Daniel would make a promise that Thomas's death would mean something, that the suffering of all those prisoners, American and Japanese alike, would not be forgotten, that humanity would endure. Captain Eleanor Mitchell became a prominent advocate for veterans' mental health after the war. She worked with both American and Japanese survivors, helping them process their trauma, helping them find ways to live with the things they had seen and done. She never forgot the prisoners she had treated, never forgot the fear in their eyes, the gratitude when she showed them kindness. And she spent the rest of her life trying to heal the wounds that war had left behind. Not just the physical wounds, but the deeper ones, the ones that didn't show up on X-rays or in medical charts, the wounds of the soul. The camp, the prisoners, the guards, they were all products of a war that had demanded the worst from humanity, a war that had turned ordinary people into soldiers, soldiers into killers, and killers into something even darker. But in the quiet moments, in the gestures of kindness, in the words spoken between enemies, they found something else. They found proof that even in the darkest times, compassion could survive, that even after the guns fell silent, the choice to see each other as human remained. And that choice, more than any battle, more than any victory, defined who they truly were. Because anyone can hate. Hatred is easy. It requires no thought, no effort, no courage. But kindness, compassion, humanity, those things require strength. They require you to look at your enemy and see not a monster but a person. They require you to choose mercy when revenge would be justified. They require you to be better than the war tried to make you. And in the Aguinaldo POW camp, in the fields of the Philippines, in the aftermath of the most destructive war in human history, a handful of ordinary people made that choice. They chose to be human. And that choice echoed across decades, across oceans, across generations. It became a testament to the idea that even in the worst of times, even when the world is burning, even when every reason exists to give in to hatred, humanity can endure. Not because it's easy, but because it's right. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and join us as we uncover more untold moments from history. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in Jim's place? And don't forget to like this video to help us share these powerful stories with the world. See you in the next one.